Greetings and salutations. I want to make sure that I've got it right and going before I say too much. That's how these things always start out, isn't it? I might be streaming and not actually see anything myself right now. Here we are. There we are. Now I can see things happening. Good. Well, greetings and salutations. Wonderful. It looks like you can hear and see us. That means we are off to a good start. I want to begin by saying happy almost birthday to my mom. Mom's birthday is on November the 8th. So this week's reading and next week's reading will be chock full of requests from Mom, particularly Shel Silverstein and Robert Frost. The cool, exciting news is that this is going to be made into a what's the term? I can never remember this. It's local cable access in Ventura, and Miss Michelle Hoover is putting that together. Wonderful. All right, got a handful of people. So, that being the case, going to start the month of November with Invitation by Shel Silverstein. If you're a dreamer, come in. If you're a dreamer, a wisher, a liar, a hoper, a prayer, a magic bean buyer. If you're a pretender, come sit by my fire, for we have some flax golden tales to spin. Come in. Come in. Magic by Shel Silverstein. Sandra's seen a leprechaun. Eddie touched a troll. Laurie danced with witches once. Charlie found some goblins' gold. Donald heard a mermaid sing. Susie spied an elf. But all the magic I have known, I've had to make myself. Mom printed that out and posted that above my door when I was a teenager. So that and one other poem was the last thing that I saw every day as I was going out to greet the world. Mom also recommended in her list of recommendations a short story by H. Munro, who wrote under the pen name Saki. And this is pertinent because I was already planning to open November with another short story by Saki. Munro was born in 1870, and he died in 1916, early in World War I. He actually turned down a commission and enlisted as a private, and such was not good for either his longevity nor the world of literature. But so the cookie crumbles. My first notice of Saki as a teenager came from this wonderful, weird, dark story that I'm going to read for you now. This is Sredni Veshtar by Saki. Conradin was 10 years old, and the doctor had pronounced his professional opinion that the boy would not live another 5 years. The doctor was silky and effete and counted for little, but his opinion was endorsed by Mrs. de Ropp, who counted for nearly everything. Mrs. de Ropp was Conradin's cousin and guardian, and in his eyes, she represented those 3/5 of the world that are necessary and disagreeable and real. The other 2/5, in perpetual antagonism to the foregoing, were summed up in himself and his imagination. Right out of the gates, that had me as a 14 or 15-year-old. One of these days, Conradin supposed he would succumb to the mastering pressure of wearisome necessary things, such as illness and coddling restrictions and drawn-out dullness. Without his imagination, which was rampant under the spur of loneliness, he would have succumbed long ago. Mrs. de Ropp would never, in her honestest moments, have confessed to herself that she disliked Conradin, although she might have been dimly aware that thwarting him for his good was a duty which she did not find particularly irksome. Conradin hated her with a desperate sincerity which he was perfectly able to mask. Such few pleasures as he could contrive for himself gained an added relish from the likelihood that they would be displeasing to his guardian, and from the realm of his imagination she was locked out, an unclean thing which should find no entrance. In the dull, cheerless garden, overlooked by so many windows that were ready to open with a message not to do this or that, or a reminder that medicines were due, he found little attraction. The few fruit trees that it contained were set jealously apart from his plucking, as though they were rare specimens of their kind blooming in an arid waste. It would probably have been difficult to find a market gardener who would offer 10 shillings for their entire yearly produce. In a forgotten corner, however, almost hidden behind dismal shrubbery, was a disused tool shed of respectable proportions, and within its walls, Conradin found a haven, something that took on the varying aspects of a playroom and a cathedral. He had peopled it with a legion of familiar phantoms, evoked partly from fragments of history and partly from his own brain, but it also boasted 2 inmates of flesh and blood. In one corner lived a ragged, plumaged hoodin hen, on which the boy lavished an affection that had scarcely another outlet. Further back in the gloom stood a large hutch, divided into 2 compartments, one of which was fronted with close iron bars. This was the abode of a large polecat ferret, which a friendly butcher boy had smuggled, cage and all, into its present quarters in exchange for long-secreted hoard of small silver. Conradin was dreadfully afraid of the lithe, sharp-fanged beast, but it was his most treasured possession. Its very presence in the tool shed was a secret and fearful joy to be kept scrupulously from the knowledge of the woman he had privately dubbed his cousin. And one day, out of heaven knows what material, he spun the beast a wonderful name, and from that moment it grew into a god and a religion. The woman indulged in religion once a week at church nearby and took Conradin with her, but to him the church service was an alien rite in the house of Rimon. Every Thursday, in the dim and musty silence of the tool shed, he worshipped with mystic and elaborate ceremonial before the wooden hutch where dwelt Saradni Vashtar, the great ferret. Red flowers in their season and scarlet berries in the wintertime were offered at his shrine, for he was a god who laid some special stress on the fierce, impatient side of things, as opposed to the woman's religion, which, as far as Conradin could observe, went to great lengths in the contrary direction. And on great festivals, powdered nutmeg was strewed in front of his hutch, an important feature of the offering being that the nutmeg had to be stolen. These festivals were of irregular occurrence and were chiefly appointed to celebrate some passing event. On one occasion, when Mr. Ropp suffered from acute toothache for 3 days, Conradin kept up the festival during the entire 3 days and almost succeeded in persuading himself that Saradni Vashtar was personally responsible for the toothache. If the malady had lasted for another day, the supply of nutmeg would have given out. The hoodin hen was never drawn into the cult of Saradni Vashtar. Conradin had long ago settled that she was an Anabaptist. Now, he did not pretend to have the remotest knowledge as to what an Anabaptist was, but he privately hoped that it was dashing and not very respectable. Miss Ropp was the ground plan on which he based and detested all respectability. After a while, Conradin's absorption in the tool shed began to attract the notice of his guardian. "It is not a good thing for him to be pottering down there in all weathers," she promptly decided, and at breakfast one morning she announced that the hoodin hen had been sold and taken away overnight. With her short-sighted eyes, she peered at Conradin, waiting for an outbreak of rage and sorrow which she was ready to rebuke with a flow of excellent precepts and reasoning, but Conradin said nothing. There was nothing to be said. Something, perhaps in his white, set face, gave her a momentary qualm, for at tea that afternoon there was toast on the table, a delicacy for which she usually banned on the ground that it was bad for him. Also, because the making of it gave trouble, a deadly offense in the middle-class feminine eye. "I thought you liked toast," she exclaimed with an injured air, observing that he did not touch it. "Sometimes," said Conradin. In the shed that evening, there was an innovation in the worship of the hutch god. Conradin had been wont to chant his praises. Tonight, he asked a boon. "Do one thing for me, Sredni Vashtar." The thing was not specified. As Sredni Vashtar was a god, he must be supposed to know, and choking back a sob, he looked at that other empty corner. Conradin went back to the world he so hated, and every evening in the welcome darkness of his bedroom, and every evening in the dusk of the tool shed, Conradin's bitter litany went up. "Do one thing for me, Sredni Vashtar." Mrs. de Ropp noticed that the visits to the shed did not cease, and one day she made a further journey of inspection. "What are you keeping in that locked hutch?" she asked. "I believe it's guinea pigs. I'll have them all cleared away." Conradin shut his lips tight, but the woman ransacked his bedroom till she found the carefully hidden key, and forthwith marched down to the shed to complete her discovery. It was a cold afternoon, and Conradin had been bidden to keep to the house. From the furthest window of the dining room, the door of the shed could just be seen beyond the corner of the shrubbery, and there Conradin stationed himself. He saw the woman enter, and then he imagined her opening the door of the sacred hutch and peering down with her short-sighted eyes into the thick straw bed where his god lay hidden. Perhaps she would prod at the straw in her clumsy impatience, and Conradin fervently breathed his prayer for the last time. But he knew as he prayed that he did not believe. He knew that the woman would come out presently with that pursed smile he loathed so well on her face, and that in an hour or two the gardener would carry away his wonderful god, a god no longer, but a simple brown ferret in a hutch. And he knew that the woman would triumph, always, as she triumphed now, and that he would grow ever more sickly under his pestering and domineering and superior wisdom, till one day nothing would matter much more with him, and the doctor would be proved right. And in the sting and misery of his defeat, he began to chant loudly and defiantly the hymn of his threatened idol. Sredni Vashtar went forth. His thoughts were red thoughts, and his teeth were white. His enemies called for peace, but he brought them death. Sredni Vashtar the Beautiful. And then, all of a sudden, he stopped his chanting and drew closer to the window pane. The door of the shed still stood ajar as it had been left, and the minutes were slipping by. They were long minutes, but they slipped by nevertheless. He watched the starlings running and flying in little parties across the lawn. He counted them over and over again, with one eye always on that swinging door. A sour-faced maid came in to lay the table for tea, and still Conradin stood and waited and watched. Hope had crept by inches into his heart, and now a look of triumph began to blaze in his eye that had only known the wistful patience of defeat. Under his breath, with a furtive exultation, he began once again the paean of victory and devastation, and presently his eyes were rewarded. Out through that doorway came a long, low, yellow and brown beast, with eyes ablink at the waning daylight and dark, wet stains around the fur of jaws and throat. Conradin dropped on his knees. The great polecat ferret made its way down to a small brook at the foot of the garden, drank for a moment, then crossed a little plank bridge and was lost to sight in the bushes. Such was the passing of Sredni Vashtar. "Tea is ready," said the sour-faced maid. "Where is the mistress?" "She went down to the shed some time ago," said Conradin, and while the maid went to summon her mistress to tea, Conradin fished a toasting fork out of the sideboard drawer and proceeded to toast himself a piece of bread. And during the toasting of it, and the buttering of it, with much butter, and the slow enjoyment of eating it, Conradin listened to the noises and silences which fell in quick spasms beyond the dining room door. The loud, foolish screaming of the maid, the answering chorus of wandering ejaculations from the kitchen region, the scuttering footsteps and hurried embassies for outside help, and then, after a lull, the scared sobbings and the shuffling tread of those who bore a heavy burden into the house. "Whoever will break it to the poor child? I couldn't for the life of me," exclaimed a shrill voice. And while they debated the matter among themselves, Conradin made himself another piece of toast. How to Eat a Poem by Eve Merriam. Don't be polite. Bite in. Pick it up with your fingers and lick the juice that may run down your chin. It is ready and ripe now, whenever you are. You do not need a knife or fork or spoon or plate or napkin or tablecloth, for there is no core or stem or rind or pit or seed or skin to throw away. So, this one is the short story that Mom suggested by Saki. It's not nearly as dark as Sredni Vashtar. A little bit funnier. I remember reading this one as a teenager, probably about the same time. This is The Open Window by Saki. My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuddle, said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. In the meantime, you must try and put up with me. Frampton Nuddle endeavored to say the correct something which should duly flatter the niece of the moment, without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much toward helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. I know how it will be, his sister had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. You will soon bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, were quite nice. Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Stapleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. Do you know many of the people round here? Asked the niece, when she judged that they had had sufficient silent communication. Hardly a soul, said Frampton. My sister was staying here at the rectory, some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here. He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. Then you know practically nothing about my aunt, pursued the self-possessed young lady. Only her name and address, admitted the caller. He was wondering whether Mrs. Stapleton was in the married or widowed state. An undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago, said the child. That would be since your sister's time. Her tragedy? Asked Frampton. Somehow in this restful country spot, tragedies seemed out of place. You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon, said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. It is quite warm for the time of year, said Frampton, but has that window got anything to do with the tragedy? Out through that window, 3 years ago today, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favorite snipe shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, and places were safe, and other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human. Poor auntie always thinks they will come back some day, and they and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening till it is quite dusk. Poor dear auntie, she has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing, Bertie, why do you bound? And as he always did to tease her, because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes, on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window. She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. I hope Vera has been amusing you, she said. She has been very interesting, said Frampton. I hope you don't mind the open window, said Miss Stapleton briskly, My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come in this way. They've been out for a snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you menfolk, isn't it? She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partial successful effort to turn the talk onto a less ghastly topic, but he was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window in the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence in mental excitement, and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise, announced Frampton, who labored under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement, he continued. No, said Miss Stapleton, in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. Here they are at last, she cried, just in time for the tea, and they don't look as if they were muddy up to the eyes. Frampton shivered slightly and turned toward the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with a dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn toward the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly, they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, "I said, Bertie, why do you bound?" Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted the stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. "Here we are, my dear," said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. "Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry." "Who was that bolted as we came up?" "Most extraordinary man. Mr. Nuttall," said Miss Stapleton, "could only talk about his illnesses, and dashed off without word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost." "I expect it was the spaniel," said the niece calmly. "He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once haunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of pariah dogs, and he had to spend the entire night in a newly dug grave with the creatures snarling and grinning and foaming just above him. Enough to make anyone lose their nerve. Romance, at short notice, was her specialty. The Pasture by Robert Frost. I'm going out to clean the pasture spring. I'll only stop to rake the leaves away and watch the water clear I may. I shan't be gone. You come too. I'm going out to fetch the little calf that's standing by the mother. It's so young it totters when she licks it with her tongue. I shan't be gone long. You come too. So this next will be an edit from one of my favorite series of books ever published. November begins a new movement in what I want to bring on Monday nights. I would like to begin a series of short stories, not the entire hour, but simply one story in the hour, will have something to do with big picture origins. It might be creation myths of various religions. It might be evidence-based cosmology, such as poetic descriptions of the Big Bang. And in this case, it will be, I admit, a rather clumsily edited mythology, one of my favorite creation mythologies of all time. This is the origin of the Earth, according to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. God, I love this. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 92 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people on it were unhappy for pretty much most of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd because on the whole, it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. And so the problem remained. Lots of the people were mean. Most of them were miserable, even the ones with digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd all made a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place, and some said that even the trees had been a bad move and that no one should have ever left the oceans. Then, one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, one girl sitting on her own in a small cafe in Rickmansworth suddenly realized what it was that had been going wrong all this time. And she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right. It would work, and no one would have to be nailed to anything. Sadly, however, before she could get to a phone to tell anyone about it, a terribly stupid catastrophe occurred, and the idea was lost forever. This is not her story. Jump forward edit to chapter 25. There are, of course, many problems connected with life, of which some of the most popular are Why are people born? Why do they die? Why do they want to spend so much of the intervening time wearing digital watches? Many, many millions of years ago, a race of hyper-intelligent pan-dimensional beings whose physical manifestation of their own pan-dimensional universe is not entirely dissimilar to our own, got so fed up with the constant bickering about the meaning of life, which used to interrupt their favorite pastime of Brochtean ultra cricket, a curious game which involved suddenly hitting people for no readily apparent reason and then running away, that they decided to sit down and solve their problems once and for all. And to this end, they built themselves a stupendous supercomputer, which was so amazingly intelligent that even before the databanks had been connected up, it had started from "I think, therefore I am," and gotten as far as the existence of rice pudding and income tax before anyone managed to turn it off. It was the size of a small city. Its main console was installed in a specifically designed executive office, mounted on an enormous executive desk of the finest ultra-mahogany, topped with rich ultra-red leather. The dark carpeting was discreetly sumptuous. Exotic potted plants and tastefully engraved prints of the principal computer programmers and their families were deployed liberally about the room, and stately windows looked out upon a tree-lined public square. On the day of the great on-turning, two soberly dressed programmers with briefcases arrived and were shown discreetly into the office. They were aware that this day they would represent their entire race in its greatest moment. But they conducted themselves calmly and quietly as they seated themselves deferentially before the desk, opened their briefcases, and took out their leather-bound notebooks. Their names were Lunkwil and Fook. For a few moments, they sat in respectful silence. Then, after exchanging a quiet glance with Fook, Lunkwil leaned forward and touched a small black panel. The subtlest of hums indicated that the massive computer was now in total active mode. After a pause, it spoke to them in a voice rich, resonant, and deep. It said, "What is this great task for which I, Deep Thought, the second greatest computer in the universe of time and space, have been called into existence?" Lunkwil and Fook glanced at each other in surprise. "Your task, O computer," began Fook. No. Wait a minute. This isn't right," said Lunkwil, worried. "We distinctly designed this computer to be the greatest one ever, and we're not making do with the second best. Deep Thought," he addressed the computer, "are you not, as we designed you to be, the greatest and most powerful computer of all time?" "I described myself as the second greatest," intoned Deep Thought, "and such I am. I speak of none but the computer that is to come after me." Fook was losing patience. He pushed his notebook aside and muttered, "I think this is getting needlessly messianic." "You know nothing of future time," pronounced Deep Thought, "and yet, in my teeming circuitry, I can navigate the infinite delta streams of future probability and see that there must one day come a computer whose merest operational parameters I am not worthy to calculate, but which it will be my fate eventually to design." Fook sighed heavily and glanced across to Lunkwil. "Can we get on and ask the question?" he said. Fook composed himself. "Oh, Deep Thought computer," he said, "the task we have designed you to perform is this. We want you to tell us..." He paused. the answer. The answer, said Deep Thought. The answer to what? Life, urged Fook. The universe, said Lunquill. Everything, they said in chorus. Deep Thought paused for a moment's reflection. Tricky, he said finally. But can you do it? Again, a significant pause. Yes, said Deep Thought. I can do it. Is there an answer? Said Fook with breathless excitement. A simple answer? Added Lunquill. Yes, said Deep Thought. Life, the universe, and everything. There is an answer, but, he added, I'll have to think about it. My circuits are now irrevocably committed to calculating the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. He paused and satisfied himself that he now had everyone's attention before continuing more quietly. But the program will take me a little while to run. Fook glanced impatiently at his watch. How long? He said. 7.5 million years, said Deep Thought. Lunquill and Fook blinked at each other. 7.5 million years, they cried in chorus. This is one of those edit points where I pause to refill my tea as we jump forward several chapters and 7.5 million years of chronology. Cut to 7.5 million later. To give you a description of the scene now, 7.5 million years later, an ecumenopolis, that's an entire planet with a single ecosystem or a single habitat, much as popularized in Star Wars, I suppose. An entire planet has now evolved to the safeguarding of this particular computer kept in a particular temple. And the clock has run out, and the whole of the galaxy is looking toward this particular planet as we resume the narrative. Oh, people waiting in the shadow of deep thought, the time of waiting is over! Wild cheers broke out amongst the crowd. Flags, streamers, and wolf whistles sailed through the air. The narrower streets looked rather like centipedes rolled over on their backs and frantically waving their legs in the air. 7.5 million years our race has waited for this great and hopefully enlightening day, cried the cheerleader. The day of the answer! Hurrahs burst from the ecstatic crowd. Never again, cried the man, never again will we wake up in the morning and think, who am I? What is my purpose in life? Does it really, cosmically speaking, matter if I don't get up and go to work? For today, we will finally learn once and for all the plain and simple answer to all these nagging little problems of life, the universe, and everything. Inside the temple, two severely dressed men sat respectfully before the terminal and waited. There was a moment's expectant pause whilst panels slowly came to life on the front of the console. Lights flashed on and off experimentally and settled down into a business-like pattern. A soft, low hum came from the communication channel. "Good morning," Deep Thought said at last. Good morning, oh Deep Thought," said Lunqual nervously. "Do you have, that is, an answer for you?" interrupted Deep Thought majestically. "Yes, I have." The two men shivered with expectancy. Their waiting had not been in vain. There really is one?" breathed Fauch. "There really is one," confirmed Deep Thought. "To everything. To the great question of life, the universe, and everything. Yes." Both of the men had been trained for this moment. Their lives had been a preparation for it. They had been selected at birth as those who would witness the answer. But even so, they found themselves gasping and squirming like excited children. "And you're ready to give it to us," urged Lunqual. "I am." "Now?" "Now," said Deep Thought. They both licked their dry lips. "Though I don't think," added Deep Thought, "that you're going to like it." "Doesn't matter," said Fauch. "We must know it. Now." "Now?" inquired Deep Thought. "Yes, now." "All right," said the computer, and settled into silence again. The two men fidgeted. The tension was unbearable. "You're really not going to like it," observed Deep Thought. "Tell us!" "All right," said Deep Thought. "The answer to the great question of life, the universe, and everything," said Deep Thought. "Yes?" "Is," said Deep Thought and paused. "Yes? Is, yes?" 42, said Deep Thought, with infinite majesty and calm. Chapter 28. It was a long time before anyone spoke. Out of the corner of his eye, Fauch could see the sea of tense, expectant faces down in the square outside. "We're gonna get lynched, aren't we?" he whispered. "It was a tough assignment," said Deep Thought mildly. 42, yelled Lunqual. "Is that all you got to show for 7.5 million years of work?" "I checked it very thoroughly," said the computer, "and that quite definitely is the answer. I think the problem, to be quite honest with you, is that you've never actually known what the question is." "But it was the great question, the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything," howled Lunqual. "Yes," said Deep Thought with the air of one who suffers fools gladly. "But what actually is it?" A slow, stupefied silence crept over the men as they stared at the computer and then at each other. "Well, it's just everything." "Everything," offered Fauch weakly. "Exactly," said Deep Thought. "So, once you do know what the question actually is, you'll know what the answer means." "Oh, terrific," muttered Fauch, flinging aside his notebook and wiping away a tiny tear. "Look, all right, said Lunqual. "Can you just please tell us the question?" "The ultimate question?" "Yes." "Of life, the universe, and everything?" "Yes." Deep Thought pondered this for a moment. Tricky, he said. But can you do it? Cried Longquill. Deep Thought pondered this for another long moment. Finally, no, he said firmly. Both men collapsed onto their chairs in despair. But I'll tell you who can, said Deep Thought. They both looked up sharply. Who? Tell us! I speak of none other than the computer that is to come after me, intoned Deep Thought, his voice regaining its accustomed declamatory tones. A computer whose merest operational parameters I am not worthy to calculate, and yet I will design it for you. A computer which can calculate the question to the ultimate answer. A computer of such infinite and subtle complexity that organic life itself shall form part of its operational matrix, and you yourselves shall take on new forms and go down into the computer to navigate its 10 million year program. Yes, I shall design this computer for you, and I shall name it also unto you. And it shall be called the Earth. There are so many mythological origin stories to the Earth, of so many people, of so many philosophies, of so many religions. That, I think I like that one better than Genesis. I really do. And I don't even mean Phil Collins. I mean the Genesis. Well, we're going to close this evening with a few more poems. This one was also a request of my mom. Happy birthday, Mom. And personally, I go for a lot of walks. Those of you who know me well know that. That's not a surprise. Nighttime, daytime, midnight. I may go for one after this reading, in fact, but this one is called Acquainted with the Night by Robert Frost. I have been one acquainted with the night. I've walked out in rain and back in rain. I've outwalked the farthest city light. I've looked down the saddest city lane. I've passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eye, unwilling to explain. I've stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye, and further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. Dust of Snow by Robert Frost. The way a crow shook down on me the dust of snow from a hemlock tree has given my heart a change of mood and saved some part of a day I had rued. Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep. But I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. And miles to go before I sleep. In conclusion, I want to give thanks to Josepha Snyder, Claire Foster, and Stefan Richter, who have contributed virtual tickets to the Venmo and/or PayPal right here below. If you would like to contribute, it would be extraordinarily appreciated. And I want to thank you all for coming and joining us for this evening ritual. We'll be back again next Monday. And check out Hunter's Acoustic Cabin for tomorrow's weekly video. I'm going to be posting an In Excess song at 11 a.m. And if you'd do me the great favor of liking it, commenting on it, sharing it's a great bonus. I'm going to leave the stream going on the fire with Wolfgang for a little while so everyone can say goodnight. And I will see you on Thursday at 6 o'clock for the next Lovecast. Thank you all.